Due to an oversupply of surplus Willys MBs and Ford GPWs right after World War II, Australia was one of the many countries that didn't see many new civilian Jeeps until the arrival of the CJ-3B in the 1950s. Given the fierce competition from Land Rover in the 1950s and Japanese automakers since then, the Australian market has never been substantial enough to support the local manufacture of Jeeps under license. Nonetheless, Willys Jeeps have been locally assembled and modified to match market demands and preferences, resulting in some unique variations. Prior to the founding of Willys Australian affiliate in 1958, Dominion Motors in Brisbane assembled completely knocked-down automobiles. Dominion's primary responsibility was to assemble English Austin products, but they also took over the assembly of Jeeps to fill in certain gaps in the line. For different reasons, they were limited to the number of Jeeps they could build, and this amounted to approximately 36 every year. Willys Motors Australia took over the import and manufacture of Jeeps at its plant in Brisbane in 1958. The CJ-3B was a 5-year-old model in the United States, so advertising it as new in Australia may have been a stretch, and this may have influenced the decision to pitch it as Australian manufactured. Willys moved to maximize the number of components made in Australia to meet Australian laws, soon advertising more than 50% Australian. In 1958, the Army began testing several vehicles to determine if they could be used to replace the UK-built Austin Champ that had been used since 1950 and the Army's aging fleet of MBs. A regular commercial Willys CJ-3B was one of the vehicles evaluated. The final report doesn't paint a very flattering portrait of the CJ-3B. According to the test summary, the Willys CJ-3B is not an acceptable vehicle for the Australian Army, with the most significant deficiencies being a lack of adequate body strength and visibility, both of which are required in the theaters where Australian troops are likely to operate. The military M38A1 was added to the test, but it did not do much better than the 3B, with broken springs and frame cracks being the most serious issues. It was also discovered to have excessive body roll and a small cab, but it wasn't rejected outright because it wasn't a Jeep model that was slated to be phased out. The Australian Army ultimately chose the new Series 2 Land Rover. But you can't really blame the Australians for not wanting to make the 3B their future light reconnaissance vehicle. Although the CJ5 was not yet available in Australia in 1958, it didn't take the Army long to figure out that the CJ3B was not the latest in Jeep technology. Despite the Army's rejection of the CJ3B, the Royal Australian Air Force did purchase some of the Jeeps. Also in 1958, pickup trucks were produced in Brisbane alongside the CJ3B. Many left the factory as cab and chassis vehicles, with enclosed or open bodies added later. By 1960, Willys Australia still had a big number of unsold CJ-3Bs from the 1958 imports and were searching for fresh ways to sell them. Willys Motors Australia apparently thought the answer was a Surrey Gala-style Jeep. The Willys Australia CJ-3B Gala was almost a complete copy of the Surrey with a panel behind the chrome front bumper, windscreen straps, Surrey roof, and rear-mounted spare. The Australian taillights, however, were different than the Hall taillights used on both Surreys and CJ-3BS in the United States after 1955. Willys Motors Australia produced over 1,000 3Bs in 1958 in both short and long wheelbases. The first CJ5 was introduced in 1959, and the line was expanded with station wagons and J-Series trucks in the 1960s. Willys introduced the stakebed FC170 forward control truck, but it was not as popular in Australia as it was in the United States. Willys Australia continued to sell FC170s with 3-speed T90 gearboxes until the late 1960s. The Australian CJ6s were actually modified CJ5s, with the frame and body stretched and converted from left to right drive. Given the high shipping costs for the larger CJ6, this was probably a more effective solution. Due to a lack of 4x4 trucks in the outback in the 1960s, lawn Jeeps were popular as working vehicles. The CJ6 was advertised as being built and engineered for Australian conditions, and this was demonstrated in 1969 when 2 CJ6 Overlanders and a CJ5 became the first vehicles to cross the Simpson Desert's 1,100 sand dunes. The Overlander was a modified CJ6 that was created specifically for the Australian market. The front of the cab was built of metal, while the back and top were made of fiberglass. The name was also later used for the CJ8. Introduced in 1965, the Combat 6 was a CJ5 or CJ6 with an Australian Ford Falcon 6-cylinder engine. During its production run, the 144 averaged 90 horsepower. While it was not known for being a powerful or stout engine, it was economical and could achieve fairly good gas mileage for the time, up to 30 miles per gallon. The Jeep Sportster, which debuted in 1967, and was inspired by the American CJ-5A Tuxedo Park, added showy paint and chrome trim and a limited slip differential. The public was unwilling to pay a premium for these extras, and the Sportster did not sell well, but it did outperform Willys Australia's previous failed fun vehicle attempt, the 1961 beach car. In 1969, 6 years after Kaiser dropped the Willys brand name in the United States, Willys Motors Australia was renamed Kaiser Jeep of Australia. American Motors Corporation, AMC, acquired Jeep in the United States in 1970. In Australia, Jeep distribution had been steadily declining, and in 1974, Kaiser Jeep of Australia went out of business. For the rest of the decade, Jeeps were imported on a private basis. AMC established Jeep Australia in 1978, just in time to begin production of the new CJ-8, known as the Overlander in Australia. Jeep models were brought back to Australia in large numbers in 1980. The new venture constructed the CJ7 and SJ Cherokee, as well as imported short and long versions of the uncommon CJ-10 truck from AM General in Michigan and VAM in Mexico. The CJ-10 was based on AMC's J10 chassis and was only available in the United States as a military aircraft tug with a short wheelbase. In Australia, it was known as the J10 or one-tonner in the early 1980s, and it was available with either an AMC 258 six-cylinder engine or a Nissan diesel. In 1982, Jeep Australia modified a few J10s for testing by the Australian Army. 3 examples of the J10 were pitted against the Mercedes-Benz 300 GD, Unimog, and the successful Isuzu-powered Land Rover 4x4 and 6x6. The J10 was not adopted by the military, much like the CJ-3B had been rejected 2 decades before. Jeep imports were once again halted in 1984 due to the falling value of the Australian dollar, which made them prohibitively expensive. Mahindra attempted to sell cars in Australia in the 1990s, but it was not a huge success. It did, however, result in some interesting models designed specifically for Australia. The basic Stockman model, which was only available in green, and the slightly more expensive Bushranger. After AMC was sold to Chrysler in the United States, Chrysler Australia began importing the Cherokee, Grand Cherokee, and Wrangler in the 1990s. Jeep is now owned by Stellantis, which was formed by the merger of Fiat Chrysler Automobiles and PSA Group in early 2021. Jeeps continue to be imported into Australia under the Stellantis umbrella. The 14 Stellantis brands are the most under one automaker, which expects to sell at least 8 million units annually around the globe, making it the world's 4th largest vehicle manufacturer. It is Jeep that made Stellantis a possibility, for without this fast-growing and now global brand, the merger might not have happened. Jeep is set to become the #1 profit driver and growth possibility for Stellantis going forward as fresh products arrive and new markets are breached. For without this fast-growing and now global brand, the merger might not have happened. The 14 Stellantis brands are the most under one automaker, which expects to sell at least 8 million units annually around the globe, making it the world's 4th largest vehicle manufacturer.